Welcome to this book discussion episode of the Share Life podcast. I'm Jason Scott Montoya, and today I'm speaking with David Koyzis. David, say hello.
Hello?
David wrote a new book, fairly new. What was it? December you published or November?
November, 26th
November.
November. Yeah.
All right, and for those of you that want, it's a Citizenship Without Illusions: A Christian Guide to Political Engagement. So we're going to dive into some passages. I've read the book, and if you haven't heard of David's previous book, it's called Political Visions and Illusions. It's a great book, and this is a little bit of a follow-up to kind of dive into some specific issues. But last time David and I spoke, he's been on the podcast. I think this is not the fourth time. So
Okay.
he's a popular one. But we discussed the essential values and virtues of our political leaders, and how we should go about voting. And that was before the election, and this is now after. And so America, Republicans, and Christians of many stripes have chosen a different path than the sort of vision and values that we sort of laid out in that previous episode. So I wanted to start us off, David. I guess I had a bit of an illusion going into the election, hoping that America would align with the values that we discussed, but has instead gone a different direction. So what are your thoughts about the election, and what do you think it tells us?
Well, I think it tells us that both political parties have become extremely dysfunctional. This is when I was writing this book, there was one sentence that I put in there. I said that the Democrats and the Republicans have become diseased parodies of their former selves.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, sure, that my editor or the anonymous reviewer would flag that and said you can't put that in the book, but they left it in there, and it may mean that it may signify that they recognize that there's something to that.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I think no matter which way the election had gone, it would have clashed in many respects with the values that Christians hold dear and the norms that we claim to follow.
Yeah. And so, here we are, I guess 4 months later, like, what are some of the kind of takeaways that you've kind of reflected on, and how you kind of see us moving forward? And if you were to cast a little bit of vision for us, what would that lean into?
Well, I think that the last few elections have pointed out it was present before, but I think the last few elections have pointed out that the system is not working as it was
Mm-hmm.
meant to.
Mm-hmm.
The system is very much off balance. It's not the same system that the founders set up at the end of the 18th century. The
Mm-hmm.
founders set up a system that was supposed to be something like the classical republic, and of course they had read deeply in Cicero and the ancient authors. Cicero
Yeah.
was writing in the transition period between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's something that the American founders were very much aware of. That how do we maintain a balanced political constitution in such a way that will avoid uh, falling into tyranny.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think um, democracy has something to do with this because the founders had assumed that in a republican form of government, there would be a balance between monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements. From if you read the ancients from Plato, Aristotle, Polybius, and on, there were three principal forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, meaning the rule of the virtuous, the virtuous few; democracy, and the assumption was always that an unmitigated democracy was a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
That was something which most of the tradition of political philosophy in the Western world would have agreed with right into the 19th and perhaps even into the 20th centuries.
Yeah.
Yeah, democratic elements, yes, but the whole system was not intended to be completely democratic. Now
Mm-hmm.
that really accelerated at the end of the 1960s, because
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the 1960s, and it had already started at the beginning of the century, there was an effort to try to more thoroughly democratize the candidate selection process within the political parties, starting
Yeah.
with the Democrats, after 1968, between 68 and 72, and then the Republicans came on side as well. And in many respects, I think it's thrown the system off balance. It's encouraged the rise of Napoleonic politics, in which you have a strong man, a strong leader who's trying to um, manipulate the system in his own interests. And I think
Yeah.
that's a very bad thing. I don't think that John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Adams and Jefferson were political opponents, but I think they would have agreed that that was a bad thing to see happen.
Yeah. Well, and I guess when you say the '60s, specifically to the political
Yeah.
structuring of parties, or do you think also culturally that it just seems like a lot happened in the '60s and '70s
Oh
that really kind
yeah.
of set the stage for where we are now?
Oh yeah, it's everything. I mean, it's the whole
Yeah.
the whole thing. I grew up during that time. I was born in the middle of the 1950s, and so I
Yeah.
was in
Mm,
elementary school through most of the 1960s and into what at the time was called junior high school and the very beginning of high school in the 1960s, and there were so many changes that took place during that decade, cultural
mm,
changes, and a lot of it had to do um, with taking um, individualism, liberal individualism, to the nth degree.
mm,
That we wanted to, what there was a slogan, do your own thing.
yeah.
People were turning on and dropping out, as it were. And
Yeah.
following their own paths and so forth. And that had already started in the 1950s, but I think in the 60s you really saw it um, beginning to I don't want to say bear fruit exactly because fruit are something which is good, but
Yeah.
it started to have, I think, a deleterious effect on the larger social
Mm,
fabric. The jokes, humor became cruder, and
mm,
a lot of the barriers against things like pornography, for example, began to
yeah.
tumble at that point.
Yeah. My word for the year last year for 2024 was unmasked, which I
Okay.
think ties into what you're saying. Like we have
Yeah.
unmasked ourselves. This is who we are. Like in some ways that can be good, like we're not pretending. But in some ways
Yeah.
it kind of reveals parts of us that are a lot darker than maybe we would have liked to admit.
Yeah, and I think maybe there's something to be said for masks. You know, I mean, we wear clothing. We
Yeah.
we dress appropriately for different kinds of occasions.
Mm,
In a sense,
yeah.
that's a kind of mask. You're not seeing the real me. The we present ourselves before the public in sometimes carefully calculated ways.
Yeah.
So just before I came on here, I converted my office to a studio format. Because I
Yeah.
have this big window in back of me, with the huge mounds of snow in the background as
Yeah.
well, and it doesn't help with the lighting. It makes things bad. So I'm sitting on a different chair than the one I usually use
Yeah.
in my office and
Yeah.
so in all sorts of ways, we put on masks, we put on different personas, and I think that's for the most part, I think that's a good thing. You
Yeah.
don't want people to be brutally honest about what you look like or what you're wearing at a particular time. You want people to be polite. You want people to
Mm,
um, follow the ordinary norms of etiquette as they're relating to
yeah.
other people, because that's the sort of thing that smooths our relationships with each other.
Mm. So it's an act. It's what I hear from you is it's an act to it's a bridge type of activity
Yeah,
to kind of shield people from the jaggedness of ourselves in a way that may be appropriate at times.
that's right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And it's a way of our reaching out to others, and becoming somebody that they can relate to.
mm, yeah. And I guess then you have the dynamic of perhaps the tension of discernment, which is
Yeah,
when to use the mask and what that should wisely look like, and when it's actually a facade for something more sinister.
exactly. That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's right.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So there is a dark side, but I think insofar as we wear masks, that itself is right and proper. But it can also hide a lot of darkness, as you properly put
yeah,
it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so here we are. We're a couple months, I guess, into the new administration for the Trump era 2.0. A lot has been happening. There's a lot of noise, a lot of chaos, a lot of confusion. Should we be concerned? And is Canada accepting new citizens?
Oh, oh yeah, we should definitely be concerned. Yes, yeah. I mean, the remarkable thing, as somebody who's written a book on political ideologies, is that that people are regarding what's going on south of the border, because I live in Canada. There's
Yeah.
uh, looking at south of the border, what's going on as somehow conservative.
Mm,
I think conservatism is a wax nose.
yeah.
You can to define it virtually any way that you want to. If you are a disciple of Edmund Burke, who is often seen as being the father of modern conservatism, who lived at in the latter part of the 18th century, wrote this brilliant book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, just months after the revolution broke out, in which he was able to see the sorts of things that were happening in it. I
Yeah.
mean, he was the person who counseled care and caution.
Mm,
If you're going to make changes, you don't simply take an axe to things and try to, you know, in a revolutionary fashion, try to upend the whole the whole system. But you have to work slowly and incrementally to make gradual changes. That will hurt the least number of people. And I
yeah.
don't think that's what's going on right now south of the border.
Yeah, and yeah, it's funny that you refer to
Yeah.
U.S. as south of the border,
Yeah.
because we refer to Mexico as south of the border.
Right, of
Uh,
course, yeah.
um, the what's interesting when you say that is because you mentioned individualism earlier and the kind of the height of it in the 60s and 70s, and I think
Yeah.
we're kind of still in that.
Yeah.
And what I see is a lot of that type of individualistic mentality, which is I want this thing, whether it's Trump himself or the administration as a whole.
Yeah.
I want this thing, and I'm just going to do it without regard to the people and the effects. And so they may
Yeah.
accomplish their objective, but they sort of have this wreckage that they leave behind them. Is that a good way to
Yeah.
think about it? Is that
Yeah, I don't think this is being done with a great deal of intelligence. I don't think it's being done with a great deal of care. We've Canada has been reprieved now twice from the threat of tariffs, and of course Trump has been making these statements about Canada being the 51st state and so
yeah,
forth. Which is insane. There hasn't been another president, as far as I know, maybe in the 19th century perhaps, that would dare to speak in those kinds of terms. But
yeah,
it's hard to take that seriously from a national leader.
yeah, yeah, and it feels like we're in a serious time with an unserious set of leaders.
Yeah,
So what about like when you think about what's going on, like what there's a lot that's happening, and I think within any sort of presidency there's a bit of give and take of like, hey,
right.
during the last several administrations there are things that happened that it may have not have liked or
Yeah,
whatnot, but when does it cross a line that like we should really be alarmed? Like, what are those lines that you think we should be looking at so that we don't get caught up in all the chaos where we're just like losing our mind every day, every second? Like, how do we stay focused on what are actually the critical things to be a citizen without illusions?
well, I think there are things to be alarmed at. I'm reluctant to say that we're in a kind of emergency situation, because emergency situations have been used by political leaders
Hmm.
down through the ages to declare martial law, to try to rule by decree. In many respects, I suspect that this is what the current administration sees itself as being in an emergency situation.
Yeah.
Whether that's true or not is, depends on a whole variety of factors. But I think, honestly, I think Trump. Um, I think he's a bit of a loose cannon. I think he makes things up as he goes along. Um, People will check up on him later, but if he's wrong, he will not admit it, because he doesn't have that kind of a personality that he's able to admit when he's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, and that's really, I think the context that we're in, I feel like your book is just such a good,
Yeah,
the timing of it, Citizenship
yeah,
Without Illusions. So tell us, like, how did you get into writing? Like, why write this?
yeah,
You had your book, Political Visions and Illusions, which is
yeah,
just an incredible framework for understanding politics as a Christian. And
yeah.
you have this little booklet that sort of follows up. What happened there? Why did you write this?
Yeah, well, I retired just under 8 years ago, and it was shortly after that that I decided to work on the second edition of Political Visions and Illusions, and IVP, University Press, accepted that, very quickly,
Mm,
and it ended up doing quite well. Tim Keller, the well-known late
hmm.
pastor from New York City, endorsed the book in July of 2020, and it sold quite well
Yeah.
after that point. He endorsed it several times
And that's
over
how
the
I heard
next
about
couple
it.
of
Is
years.
he posted it on Twitter, and I went and
Oh
bought the
yeah,
book.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that's right.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
and actually, I was just in New York City this last month, and I was speaking in a church. I was actually had some contact with two churches, both of which have been influenced by Keller's ministry, and I think
Mm,
that's probably where they heard
yeah,
about my book as well.
yeah.
But yeah. So then a few years ago, I was talking with a friend of mine who was a provost at a Baptist seminary in North Carolina, and he said, David, you should think of writing a book about citizenship. And I can't say that the idea was completely new to me, but actually I'm finding that this man, his name is Bruce. He's a bit of a muse for me. He's been able to inspire me to do some things. So I thought, well, okay, let's give it a try. And as a matter of fact, this book was pretty low hanging fruit.
Yeah,
So my first two books, each of them took 7 years to write. This one only took me a few months because it was really something of a summation of my uh, teaching career over the course of 30 years.
yeah,
So it was based on teaching. It was based on conversations that I had with colleagues, with students, and so forth. And so there were things that I was thinking about and had thought about for the better part of half a century.
mm,
And so I wrote this book. I know that there were some people that thought I should address this in a more of the crisis in American politics,
yeah,
and I think there is a crisis.
yeah,
Um, but at the same time, I didn't want to write a book that would be quickly dated by the events of the day. And
yeah.
also the fact that I've lived in Canada for 40 years now. I was born in the United States, lived there for 30 years. I've lived in Canada for 40 years now, so it's most of my life.
Yeah.
And I wanted to write a book that would be applicable internationally.
Hmm.
So North America is obviously the greatest focus of the book, but I also mention Australia. I have mentioned Brazil because my first book has been translated into Portuguese and has done quite well in
Yeah.
Brazil. So I wanted to have something that would speak to people, across international boundaries, and because the body of Christ exists across international boundaries, and I myself am very much aware that that I have brothers and sisters living in many countries throughout the world, and some of these I've been able to talk with in the course of my academic ministry over the last several years.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think opportunities like podcasts like this give you the chance to take what's in the book and
yeah,
apply it to the circumstances and news of the day
yeah.
in a way that doesn't make the book outdated, but allows you to address those very things.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that the people who read my first book, there were some people who told me that they were blown away by it, but
Yeah.
then they would come back and say, well, but what do I do with this? Because
Yeah.
the parties that we have to vote for, they have all been affected in some fashion
Hmm.
by these, idolatrous ideologies.
Hmm.
And if that's the case, how do we go about voting? How do we go about getting
Hmm.
involved in political life? And so that's what I wrote this book, Citizenship Without Illusions. The illusions in the title being an allusion to the title of my first book, Political Visions and Illusions. And so, try to give people some practical guidance as to how to live as Christians, responsible citizens of their respective earthly polities.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's who Oswald Chambers is, I assume,
Yeah,
who wrote
yeah,
Up My Utmost for His Highest. So
yeah.
he's got one of his devotions is called The Teaching of Disillusionment, and it's just
Okay.
one of my favorites. And he says, "We are not true to one another as facts, seeing each other as we really are. We are only true to our misconceived ideas of one another. According to our thinking, everything is either delightfully good, evil, malicious, and cowardly." So we kind of go
Huh.
to these sort of extremes of like
Yeah.
it's either black and white, and we kind of fail to see it. And really, he talks about a lot of horrible things that happen in human history are the fact that we don't allow ourselves to be disillusioned we continue to stay in the illusion. And so I connect your book to the works of Oswald Chambers in that regard.
Oh, well, thank you.
um, so I guess would there be anything else you'd want to talk about the book before I dive into some of my questions about it in
Yeah,
terms of the history or the writing of it or the process of crafting it?
yeah, it was a fun book to write. I actually did some interviewed some people for it.
Oh,
Some people
cool.
that I've known for quite a long time. The
Yeah.
one was Stanley Carlson Teese, whom I've known since the late 1970s. That's getting
Okay.
on almost 50 years right there. And he served in the White House, in the George W. Bush White House in 2001, 2002. I think he was only in there for about maybe 17, 18 months,
Oh, okay.
uh,
Wow.
uh, uh, working in the faith-based, and I forget the exact title, but there was an organization within the White House that liaisoned with
Hmm.
faith-based uh, organizations in the
Yeah.
United States. So he was involved with that. And so, his work I've highlighted in here. There's a lot of local color as well. I live in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, and there's an organization called Indwell,
Hmm.
that provides supportive housing for people in need in this community. And it started in Hamilton, but is now starting to make its way into other communities in southern Ontario as well.
Yeah.
And I interviewed a couple of people who were connected with that.
Yeah.
So it was a fun book to write. And as I was writing, I found myself focusing more than I had anticipated on the local level.
Yeah.
And that was, that you probably are aware that, the authors of fiction will sometimes create a character, and the character becomes so fleshed out that the character runs away with the
Hmm.
plot. And that's what I found as I was
Yeah.
writing this book. It's not at all a work of fiction,
Yeah.
but it's I hadn't intended to focus so much on the local level as I ended up doing. Now,
Yeah.
the last but one chapter does deal with global citizenship, because I think that's important to take into
Yeah.
account. But I think the bulk of our efforts, if we're going to be able to see the results of our labors, we're going to see them more on the more local levels,
Hmm.
in our immediate communities.
Yeah.
And in some ways, maybe focusing on the national level, as we tend to do, in many ways that deflects us from putting our efforts into the flesh and blood communities that have nurtured us and have shaped our identities.
Yeah. Well, I think of two things. So one is Jennifer Garvey Berger wrote a book about leadership mind traps, and she talks about when you have a very complex and large system, it's very hard to change it from the core. And so she recommends experiment around the edges, and those experiments can turn into things that can sort of roll up into bigger things.
Huh.
And so that's kind of how I think about the local level is they're almost like these mini
Yeah.
laboratories. I mean, you could kind of think of that in the United States, you have a state, the states are mini laboratories, but even counties and cities are mini
Exactly.
laboratories within them.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think that's very important, because that's one of the key features of federalism. With
Hmm.
the federal division of powers, that you can always start at the local level. You try something in one state or province, see whether it works, and then you apply it to the whole. For
Yeah.
for example, Americans are probably aware that in Canada we have universal health care.
Hmm.
And that started in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Tommy Douglas was the first national leader of the New Democratic Party. He himself was a Baptist minister. He was the premier of Saskatchewan,
Hmm.
and it started. Healthcare, universal healthcare started on the provincial level.
Yeah.
And so once it had worked in Saskatchewan, he was the premier of Saskatchewan, then the rest of the country could start adopting it on a province by province basis.
Yeah.
Okay, now contrast that to the Affordable Care Act under Barack Obama. Start with a website that would be accessible to everybody in the nation, and it soon crashed.
Hmm.
I don't think that was the proper place to start. Rather
Yeah.
than starting at the national level, it would have been much better to start at the state level. because
Yeah.
that there's a reason why federal systems have been so successful. If a particular innovation does not work, then the 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 effects of the failure will be limited to
Hmm.
those people in that particular state or province. If it
Yeah.
does work,
Yeah.
then other states and provinces can adopt that and work on implementing it within their own jurisdictions.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's
Yeah,
great. And I think that kind of leads to the second thing I was going to say, which is
yeah,
the things that are happening in this administration, particularly with Elon Musk and Doggy, Doge, however you want to say it,
yeah,
Department of Government Efficiency, they're just cutting and slashing things, and it's actually
yeah,
affecting people. I mean, I actually have a client I lost a couple weeks ago because it was a client that loved working with me, but there were congressionally approved funds that had to do with their industry, and they've been blocked. They've been held hostage, and so they're not able
okay,
to get them, and so they're just paralyzed,
yeah,
and so they can't be paying me. But I know other
oh,
people, farmers, people that are being affected by USAID, all these
yeah,
local, individuals in local communities are being affected in very
yeah,
negative ways. Unintended consequences. Some there's people that they didn't care, I guess, when they did it.
right.
I feel like there's a connection between the two of the federal and the local in a way that we're seeing now that perhaps people were maybe unaware of. I don't
Yeah.
know. What are your thoughts on that? Like we're part of something bigger, but we don't necessarily see it all the time.
No, I think that's true. I think that's true. I mentioned Indwell, this organization here in Hamilton. It gets money from three levels of government, from the federal, provincial, and the municipal government as well.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you to try to get the federal and provincial governments to agree on a strategy for dealing with homelessness, for example, scarce housing and so forth. To get the two levels of government to agree is very difficult
Hmm.
in Canada. Federal provincial relations are always conflictual in some fashion. But the wonderful thing about this is that the funding that goes to Indwell, there are some strings attached to it, but basically Indwell is able to set its own agenda as to what is suitable for the local level.
Hmm.
So it's the decisions are not being made by certainly not by Justin Trudeau, the
Hmm.
Prime Minister of Canada, not by Doug Ford, who's the Premier of the province, or the Mayor of
Yeah.
Hamilton. It's being made by the people on the ground.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I don't know a lot about USAID, but I suspect that um, that it's that the way that it works, that there was a lot of devolution to responsibility,
Hmm.
devolution of responsibility to the local levels.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like that because I think that really goes to the essence of who America is, which is this idea of shared power. We
Right.
distribute power,
Yeah.
and what's happening is there's a shift towards a consolidation of power.
Yeah.
So you have one person that's directing all of these different things versus having
Right.
these layers of power that is distributed. And
Yeah.
one, I just don't think that's effective. It's I think
No.
incompetent, but it's also dangerous.
I think so, yeah, yeah, and that's somewhat ironic because a lot of people who would style themselves conservatives would favor decentralization. The,
Hmm.
the the little platoons that Edmund Burke spoke about in
Hmm.
his Reflections on the Revolution in France.
Yeah.
Um, you know, uh, so in some ways, uh, it seems to be it's counterintuitive. It maybe
Hmm.
it'll probably prove to be counterproductive over the long term and maybe even the
Yeah.
short term.
Yeah, this is sort of my working hypothesis is that America is a bit like one of those finger traps. And the
Oh
more you
yeah,
try and get out of it, the more like stuck you are. You have to
yeah,
kind of like calmly and sort of slowly pull your fingers out. And my hope is that like the system sort of collapses in on itself in a sense of
yeah,
like it doesn't
yeah,
allow for people to abuse the power in any severe kind of sense. But we'll see if
yeah.
my
One
hypothesis
one
works
hopes so.
out.
Yes, one hopes so.
So let's jump into the book.
Okay.
One of the main thrusts is this idea of wrestling with faithfulness to Christ and our calling while also engaging politically in a connected and appropriate way. So, talk to us about that idea of faithfulness as Christians specifically.
Yeah, yeah. Let me first say that how to be faithful as citizens is not essentially different from a whole series of issues. How are we faithful in family life? How are we faithful in church life? How are we faithful in business? How are we faithful in commerce? How are we faithful in the
Mm-hmm.
arts? There's every uh, avenue of service is a fit avenue for being faithful to God. The recognizing that we live lives of grateful obedience to the will of God before the face of God,
Mm-hmm.
in his creation. So, citizenship is not essentially different from any of these other offices, these authoritative offices that we bear
Mm.
as God's image.
Yeah.
Okay, that said, there are certain complications in exercising our citizenship because we share the public space, the polity. We share the polity with people who may have different um, ultimate commitments that differ from our own.
Yeah.
So Christians share the polity with atheists, agnostics, with devout Christians, with merely nominal Christians, with Muslims, with Jews, with Mormons and adherents of different religions, and that means
Yeah.
that we have to find a way to get along with each other, to bridge the multiple gaps
Mm-hmm.
that exist between us as individuals, but also between our various communities.
Yeah.
That's the tricky part.
Yeah.
That's the tricky part. And there are no, there are no there are no shortcuts to doing that. And it
Mm-hmm.
takes very careful work, sitting down, listening to each other, and I think that's even more important than talking.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about parliaments. Parliament from the French word parler. To talk.
Yeah.
But listening might be an even better uh,
Yeah.
way to describe it. I wish there were a word that could be used to describe a parliament in a way that would emphasize that we are listening to each other. And taking each
Yeah.
other's concerns seriously. And so the kind
Yeah.
of deliberation, the kind of negotiation that takes on in the political realm, it's you can't replace that with something else. And
Yeah.
the idea of just coming down and saying, okay, we're going to do this, that, and the other thing, by
Mm-hmm.
by decree.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't think that's good. That's not really politics. It's
Yeah.
it's it's something else, but
Yeah.
it doesn't recognize that there is a diversity of interests in the polity that need to be
Mm-hmm.
conciliated in a way that would allow people to live together peacefully. And
Yeah.
not everybody will get what they want out of the process, but nevertheless, there has to be a certain minimal uh, area of agreement that will enable us to get along with each other.
Yeah. Yeah. If you have two people and one person is sort of forcing them to move a certain direction,
Yeah,
I kind of think of like a rubber band. They're eventually going to like rubber snap back, and
yeah,
then they're going to pull you with them. It's just going to be this. I mean, I think we see this even with just an American system of executive orders where you have one president rolls all these
that's right.
executive orders out, the next
Yeah,
one undoes them and then does theirs. And it's
that's
just like
right.
we're just like whiplashing ourselves. And because they're wanting to create such drastically different worlds, it's a very dramatic shift, from one president to the next.
Right, right. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of executive orders, or the Canadian equivalent orders in council,
Yeah.
because those are not subjected to legislative scrutiny.
Yeah.
And I actually looked it up, and I discovered that the two presidents that had issued the most executive orders were Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson.
Oh,
Over
wow.
1,000 within their two each, within
Yeah.
their two terms in office. Nobody has come even close to that.
Yeah.
As of I think Donald Trump, I think, has issued um, just in the first weeks of his presidency, almost a third of the total number that Biden issued during his two
Wow.
terms in office.
Yeah. And he came into office ready to roll those out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's right. Yeah.
So, and that I think kind of ties in the next question I have about the rule of law. So, on page 32 of the book, for those of you that are following along, you say that contempt for the law is a precursor to tyranny. A few pages later, you say, those who think we would be better off without a uniform political order need only remind themselves of the sad fate of people and countries where such order has broken down.
Yeah.
So if those statements are the dashboard lights of the American car, they seem to be blinking red right now. Talk to us
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
this idea.
Yeah. I would be much happier if if public officials were utterly convinced of the virtue of following the rule of law.
Hmm.
Abraham Lincoln, he delivered something about the laws, obedience to the law, respect for the law, as being he called it like the political religion of Americans. He wanted mothers to inculcate that in their children. Respect for the
Hmm.
laws and so forth. And the rhetoric was probably a bit overblown, but given what he was facing, a bloody civil war in the 1860s, it's understandable that
Yeah.
that he would take that. Although actually, I think he delivered this before he became president.
Mm.
So it's
Yeah.
but nevertheless, the rule of law is not something you could take for granted.
Hmm.
Russia is a country where the rule of law has never sunk deep roots. Even during the Tsarist period, there were multiple abortive attempts to come up with a unified uh, legal code that would be binding on the entire country.
Hmm.
But it didn't really work because people were used to their own customary laws that were entirely local.
Hmm.
They were not written down, but everybody knew what they were, and they varied from one
Mm.
place to the next.
Yeah.
And in that kind of a context, having a legal system that was um, that was applicable to the entire country and treated everybody as equal citizens, equally subject to the law, that was foreign to Russians. So
Yeah.
when communism fell, in 1989 to 1991, and then that turbulent decade of the 1990s, and then you have Vladimir Putin taking over on virtually the last day of the century. Uh, uh, there were hopes that Russia could become democratic, but if without that political culture of respect for the rule of law, democracy um, didn't have much of a chance to get off the ground.
Yeah.
You
And then you
really
have the
have to
rule
have
of the,
yeah, you have
yeah.
to have a strong sense of the rule of law, respect for the rule of the law before anything like democracy can get off the ground.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
in the case of Russia, it's become the rule of lawlessness.
yeah,
And
absolutely, yeah,
that's the counter is, if I'm a criminal and I want to do what I want to do, then I need to change it from the rule of law to the rule of lawlessness so that I can get away with what I want to do.
that's right, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And so but kind of by that point, it could be too late. Like, what are you going to do once it's when the paradigm's flipped, you know?
that's right, yeah, yeah. Well, this is why there really has to be uh, a, a a pre-existing political culture of respect for constitutional governance, for the
Hmm.
rule of law. The American founders did not create this.
Yeah.
John Adams recognized that this we're creating a republic, and it's only fit for a people that have moral and religious sensibilities.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's a famous quotation of his. I know I'm not. It's not the exact quotation, but recognizing that the colonials living on the eastern seaboard of what's now the United States, they had already had generations of experience in self-governing government.
Hmm.
Going back to the founding of the colonies in the early part of the 17th century. So the American founders did not create the political culture. They created a system that was in accordance with a pre-existing political culture, and then Americans made it work.
Hmm.
Americans have this mythology that their founders were just these brilliant constitutional architects that created a fail-safe system. Well, they didn't, and they themselves recognized that they couldn't do that. That was
Hmm.
beyond their capabilities of doing that. But
Yeah.
if there was a real genius in the American system, it was in the hearts of the people themselves and their willingness to live under the system that the founders put together.
Yeah.
Now, I very much fear that over the last generation or so, uh, that political culture has been eroded.
Yeah. And I think that's where one of our missions, and I think kind of what you're also talking about in the book in terms of teaching and education is
Yeah,
is teaching about why our system matters and why it's
Yeah.
important and what's important about it. And it's almost like in a lot of ways we're teaching basketball players, here's how you tie your shoes. I
Yeah.
know you wear your shoes and we take that for granted, but we kind of have to not take for granted that you know how to tie your shoes. And I feel like that's where we're at with this sort of democracy thing.
Right. 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 Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
a great organization called Democracy First, and they're actually asking political leaders to make a pledge. And it's kind of like, hey, we want you to pledge to tie your shoes. So they have four things. They say pledge to protect the right to vote for eligible citizens, denounce threats or attempts to incite violence against
Right.
political opponents and election workers, stop the spread of falsehoods and misinformation about the electoral process, and accept and certify the final election results according to the law after all ballots are counted. And again, it's kind of these sort of baseline things, but they're
It's
wanting
so
political
basic.
can
It's so
yeah.
basic. You would think that that would be taken for granted.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but we're in a world where we can't, and we have to actually do the work. So
Sad to say, that's true. Yeah.
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 Now I think this ties into the next question. On page
Okay.
39, you say if we genuinely seek the truth of a given issue or event, we can't
Yeah.
cut corners and go for what we find as agreeable. Tell us more about truth and cutting corners.
Yeah. Well, this has to do with how we uh, receive information and what we do with it, because we are
Hmm.
now living in a world where we are absolutely bombarded with information from multiple sources. And some of that is misinformation, some of it is outright disinformation, and we need to be able to distinguish between truth and falsehood.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, the vast majority of people are not going to um, take the time and the effort to research um, what they're seeing online, to test whether something is true or false.
Hmm.
So unfortunately, I'm afraid that we're living in a world where will have vast numbers of people that are buying into outright falsehoods,
Hmm.
and that's a reality that we need to take into account on the ground.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I mentioned, I talk about in back in the mid 1970s when I was a young man, the Cyprus crisis. My father was born in Cyprus,
Okay.
and it's divided between Greeks and Turks. Uh, uh, the island was divided in 1974, just as I was in my just after my first year in university as an undergraduate, and all of my relatives there became refugees overnight.
Mm.
And I wished at that time that we could get raw information from the ground to find out what was happening, because
Yeah.
everything was filtered through
Mm.
ABC, NBC, you know,
Yeah.
CBS, the Chicago Tribune, because I grew up in the
Hmm.
Chicago area. At that time, the Chicago Daily News, that's been gone for almost half a century, but that was the paper that we subscribed to get raw information on the ground. Well, half a century later, my wishes have been granted,
Wow.
in a way that I couldn't have imagined half a century ago. And at the time, I wish that were the case. Now, I find myself regretting. Whoa, people are taking information. It may be raw information, it may be highly processed information, it may be doctored information,
Yeah.
but people are not doing the homework to find out what's what.
Hmm.
And so that's the scary thing.
Yeah.
There's still a place for professional news gathering organizations that are in
Hmm.
the business of gathering information, distilling it, and finding out, what's fit to print, what is fit to, what is important that people
Yeah.
need to know about.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember when Russia invaded Ukraine,
Yeah,
there was a lot of misinformation out there, and I went out and found people that were like in Ukraine and that had lived in Russia, and like getting their perspective
yeah,
and on the ground information, and just how hard it was to find those sources,
yeah.
and just how many middlemen there were that were sort of kind of it all kind of sort of narrowed in. And so now there was a lot more ability to do that, but I imagine, yeah, 50, 100 years ago, you didn't have that unless you actually went or you had a journalist that
Yeah,
went.
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So anything else you would say about the truth and cutting corners layer?
Yeah, yeah. Don't take the shortcuts. It's if you see something, if you're on Facebook and you see something and you think, oh, I want to repost that, uh, be careful what you're reposting,
Yeah.
because it may be that what you're reposting, if it may sound plausible, but it may actually be very far from the
Yeah.
truth.
Yeah, and one of the things I'll do is if I see something that I do want to repost, I'll try and find one or two other places that are
Exactly.
confirming it. So I
Yeah,
look
that's
for
right.
confirmation before I just go with it,
Yeah,
and then that kind of protects me from like doing stupid things.
that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it shouldn't take that long to do that.
Yeah,
It's not as though we need to go to a library and look
yeah,
things up and find
yeah,
out, or wait for the next issue of Time or Newsweek to come
yeah,
out, before we can do that. I mean,
yeah.
it's all of it not only is the information at our fingertips, but also the ways of verifying that information.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah,
that's at our fingertips as well.
yeah.
Yeah,
So I want to talk about the next thing. So on page 55, you say that the
yeah,
following about Martin Luther King Jr. And I think he really just is such a
yeah,
powerful and inspirational example
yeah,
that we can just, there's so much we can learn from his example and his actions and words. But you say on page 55, disobeying an unjust law and accepting the personal consequences of so doing, an individual raises awareness of injustice and
yeah.
therefore is actually expressing the highest respect for the law. So tell us about that dynamic. And
Yeah.
I'd also like you to contrast that to the opposite. Trump has made some recent comments. He made some Napoleon comment. He quoted Napoleon. He
Yeah,
also
right.
said stuff like "I am the law," essentially,
Yeah,
some sense paraphrasing
yeah,
it in different ways. But
right.
the law, I am the law, and the law stops with me. So,
Yeah.
how would you contrast these two dynamics of like what's lawful and not, and then whether you embody it or not, and in the power dynamics as well?
Yeah, yeah. Dr. King, I grew up during the era when he was active.
Mm-hmm.
I was 13 when he was assassinated. And
Mm-hmm.
I still remember we were going to a church potluck, a fundraising potluck, when we heard on the radio what had happened. I just and absolutely astonished, absolutely very upset to
Mm-hmm.
see that happen. And about 5 years earlier than that, he was sitting in a jail in Birmingham, Alabama, and he wrote this famous letter from Birmingham jail. And it's you can buy that from
Yeah, it's
booksellers. You
incredible.
can you
Yeah.
can find it. Yeah, you can find it online. So I think what I referred to in the book, it's an online uh, uh, location for the letter from Birmingham jail, and he talks about the relationship between law and justice, and he said, well, a law that is that is oppressive, and that is unjust, is not a true law. I don't know that I would go as far as he goes. I think that as a legal philosophy, I don't think you could run with that very far. But I think he's correct in indicating that there are times when disobedience to an unjust law is itself justified.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, if that happens, then you have to accept the consequences of
Mm-hmm.
doing that, and that's why he ended up in jail. I mentioned also of this Reverend Wang Yi, who is
Mm-hmm.
the pastor of this early rain church in Chengdu, China.
Okay.
He became a Christian only about 20 years ago, but yet uh, uh, so much is his faith living in his heart that he's willing to go to prison in China for the sake of the gospel. And that's, as
Yeah.
far as I know, that's where he is at the present time.
Mm.
So now, man, these are people who, they respect the law, but they also understand the limits of the law and what laws can do and what they ought not to do.
Yeah.
And if the law is if there are claims to legality, um, on the part of people who are committing outright injustices, then it may be that civil disobedience is warranted in those
Yeah.
situations.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So how would you contrast that to his Trump's remarks about his Napoleon remarks, where he might say,
yeah.
"Well, I'm saying it's an unjust law, so I'm going to defy the court's rulings." What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. That's a recipe for chaos. In 1977, Richard Nixon, who had resigned a few years earlier from the presidency, was being interviewed by David Frost He was a British journalist, and he said, quite openly, he said, "Well, when the president does something, it's not illegal." And
Hmm.
people were outraged at the time. I was outraged myself. Watergate and the Cyprus crisis were two things
Mm.
that really pushed me towards the study of political science as an undergraduate.
Oh
Because
wow.
up until that time I was a music major. And
Yeah,
I still love
yeah.
music. Um, but it's and now it seems as though there's a leader who's now claiming to be above the law, and it seems as though he's gotten quite a bit of the Supreme Court on his side as well, which I was uh,
Hmm.
astonished at the ruling that was made. I think it was last year. Uh,
Yeah.
the This goes back to Magna Carta.
Hmm.
In 2015, there was an exhibit at Fort York in Toronto, and they were early copies of Magna Carta. This was to commemorate the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, the great charter in which the barons of the realm forced King John to sign this great charter that would guarantee their rights and to recognize that the king is under the law, that the king is
Mm.
not above the law, but the king is under the law.
Yeah.
That's part of the constitutional heritage of all English-speaking countries: United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom itself. It's part of our heritage. And if anything, Americans have made more of Magna Carta than even Canadians have, even though it's
Yeah.
part of our shared constitutional heritage. And to see now uh, uh, people taking seriously somebody who's claiming to be above the law, that goes against Magna Carta. It goes against the 800 years of our constitutional legacy.
Yeah. Yeah. So earlier in the conversation, you did mention Napoleon. So
Yeah,
tell
that's
us
right.
why like, I think maybe people were like, yeah, Napoleon, great. We can get stuff done. We have a president
Yeah.
that gets stuff done. Like, why should we be, not be so excited about that?
Well, Napoleon, he had good intentions. I mean, that sounds kind of funny to say, but he wanted to bring the whole of Europe under one law, one legal system. In many respects, he succeeded in that because most legal systems in continental Europe and even in the province of Quebec here in Canada, Louisiana as well, is a civil code jurisdiction. They can look back to the Napoleonic Code as being a precursor to their legal systems. But Napoleon wanted to do so by conquering Europe and bringing Europe under his rule. But there's no way that one imperial figure can possibly do justice to the diverse peoples that live on the ground.
Yeah.
And in many respects, I think it may be that even the United States and Canada are too big to be able
Hmm.
to do justice to the local communities
Hmm.
on the ground in both of our countries. In Canada, we have 40 million people now. We've grown quite a bit, mostly through immigration in recent
Oh, wow.
years. But when I first came to
From which countries?
Oh, all over the place.
Oh,
It's
okay.
yeah, not so much the European countries that were the
Yeah.
historic sources of immigration for this country, but we have a lot of people from South Asia, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and
Oh,
so
wow.
forth, Bangladesh,
Yeah.
from African countries and so forth. That's that's fine. I think we've probably brought them in a little bit too quickly.
Yeah.
Before we were really able to house people, and that's driven up the cost of housing quite a bit
Mm.
in this country. That's
Yeah.
not a good thing. But that's the kind of thing that has elicited the sort of backlash that we're seeing, this populist backlash. Uh, you know, we want to welcome immigrants, but we want to do so in a way that's
Hmm.
orderly. We want to do so in a way that will not push people out of their jobs, people that are already here out of their jobs and out of their housing and so
Yeah.
forth. But that's something that that even our government in Canada uh, miscalculated. How we want to do the right thing. Okay, we want to be a welcoming country, but we also want to do it in a way that will not damage the citizens who are already here. And that's
Yeah.
something that probably our governments have not been careful enough about. And that's the sort of thing
Hmm.
that's elicited the populist backlash that we're seeing, not just in Canada, but in the not only in the United States, but also in in France,
Hmm.
in the Netherlands now, in Germany.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. So I think it's kind of ties into the next topic, which is
yeah,
in terms of dealing with people that are different than us.
yeah.
So in your chapter on how to vote, you talk about making it a priority to speak with people who vote and see things differently. And you talked earlier about listening. Why is community and conversation with our rivals a vital habit for flourishing?
Because if we don't talk with each other, if we don't listen to each other, we are going to imagine that that our opponents are mortal enemies. The British political scientist by the name of Sir Bernard Crick, uh, he wrote a book in 1962 called In Defense of Politics.
Hmm.
Brilliant book. I think I have 3 copies of it in my personal library. I would
Okay.
assign that to my students to read. It's but he says that politics uh, it's not it's not climbing to utopia. It's a very ordinary way of trying to live with our neighbors with whom we have material and convictional differences.
Yeah.
The people believe different things. People have different interests that they want to see
Hmm.
protected. How do we live with each other? That requires us to sit down, or at least for our representatives to do that, to sit down and to hash things out with
Hmm.
people potentially on the other side,
Yeah.
to try to come to some kind of a minimal agreement on
Hmm.
how to do things, on how to come up with a approximate justice.
Yeah.
Not God's final justice, but a justice that will always be partial, but will enable us to get along in the here and now.
Yeah. 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 I think it's so helpful and insightful because I think it's just critical. And I think right now we're in an environment where it's very difficult to do that. But I
Yeah,
think Christians have the calling to do it anyway, to step
that's right.
into it. Because if
That's
we
right.
won't do it, then nobody's going to.
That's right. No, it's true. It's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, I was super excited to see that you expanded on in the from your book the idea of conservative versus progressive. So you have a
Right.
chapter dedicated to that in this new book.
Yeah.
And for those that aren't familiar, the idea is like in the first book, you have all these ideologies like
Yeah.
liberalism or nationalism. And
Yeah.
what you're saying is you can be a progressive nationalist or a conservative nationalist or
Yeah.
a progressive liberal or a conservative liberal. But at the
Yeah.
core, you have an ideology.
Yeah.
So I want to highlight just one thing you said on page 107. You say recognizing the effects of change has prompted people to sort themselves into progressives and conservative groupings, with progressives pushing for innovation across a wide spectrum of human life and conservatives more skeptical of proposals for reform. And you quote G.K. Chesterton, who says the business of progressives is to go on making mistakes. The business of conservatives is to prevent mistakes from being corrected. Talk
Yeah.
to us more about this.
Yeah, I love Chesterton. He was always coming up with these very pithy, very, very clever comments, that had some ironies built into them. But progressing and conserving, really, they really are siblings. You really can't have one without the other.
Yeah.
I will not call myself a progressive in an unmitigated sense any more than I will call myself a conservative in an
Yeah.
unmitigated sense. Conservatism is there's so much um, that you can put into the conservative vision, into a conservative vision, and no two conservatives will agree as to what the content of that vision should be. But it's the same with progressives as well. What are we going to progress to?
Hmm.
Um, but both of them, I think, can become ideological insofar as they refuse to recognize the other side.
Hmm.
So progressives really are building on, traditions that have been around for a very
Hmm.
long time. They may not want to admit it, but they are. And in the same way,
Yeah.
conservatives um, have to recognize that the traditions that have been handed down to us, they're going to be a mixed bag. There's going to be good and bad. There are things that will be better off without. We
Yeah.
talked about Martin Luther King a few moments ago, and that tradition of segregation enshrined in law in the various southern states. It just absolutely vicious. Treated
Yeah.
Black Americans viciously. There was the threat of lynching and trying to keep
Hmm.
people down it's just a horrible thing. That's a tradition that we are better off without.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
if you're just a conservative and won't admit, just say I'm a conservative, well, you don't have any kind of norms that will enable you to be able to sort through the
Hmm.
multiplicity of traditions that have been handed down.
Yeah. You'll turn
But the
into
same,
Frankenstein.
yeah, well, yeah, and the same with progressives. That you
Yeah.
can't, what are you trying to progress to?
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
are the criteria that you are using for progressing from point A to point B to point Z? It's those are the
Yeah.
sorts of things that I hate to say simple-minded progressives or simple-minded conservatives cannot really they can't really help us with.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And it almost seems like, as Christians, we should be conserving good things.
yeah,
And we should, as a Christian, we should also be progressing things that are not good towards the good,
yeah,
right?
absolutely. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Um,
and what that looks like at any particular time,
yeah. Yeah.
that's the hard work.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
need to think through. You need to talk about these sorts of things. What are we going to keep, and what are we going to leave behind? What do we want to move towards? And
Yeah.
it means that we need to hear each other out. We need to listen.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So you talked a little bit earlier about the idea, and you kind of talk about this in the book as it
yeah,
progresses towards the end.
yeah.
Um, the idea of incremental and steady improvements versus earth-shaking massive ones,
That's right.
which the current Trump administration is trying to do these sort of massive,
Yeah,
sweeping changes.
yeah.
They're trying to progress in that sense. So talk to us about that, the idea of incremental and steady improvements, and also the idea of like maintaining what we have and building on
Yeah.
top of it versus like tearing it down and trying to build something new.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the insight of Edmund Burke. Uh,
Okay.
yeah, at the end of the 18th century, his reflections on the Revolution in France. He had other writings as well. That's probably his best known one. And his critique of the French Revolution, the French revolutionaries, just months into the Revolution, 1789, 1790, was that they were attempting to uh, completely start over. You know, get rid of everything and then start over supposedly on rational foundations.
Hmm.
So the revolutionaries wanted to have a 10-day week rather than a 7-day week. They wanted to decimalize the week, as it were. They wanted
Yeah.
to start the year one. They wanted to start over again. And they would 1792 would be the beginning of a new era. They would start, and all of that lasted until like about 1805, 1806, when Napoleon pretty much got rid of all of that stuff.
Hmm.
But Burke said, no, you can't do that. You can't start over. There's the what we have been given by our predecessors. There's a huge store of traditions. We if you walk into a city, you'll see buildings that have been around for a long time. If you go into a European city, you'll see a cathedral that may go back to the Middle Ages. You'll see maybe newer buildings that have been built since then. You'll see Baroque buildings. You'll see Gothic buildings. You'll see the date from different eras, and all of those things make up the city of they make up the character of the city. The same with a nation, or even with subculture within a nation. There's a whole complex of traditions that go into making the people who they are, and we need to
Hmm.
respect those, and we need to build on those rather than claiming to get rid of everything and start over. Because when
Yeah.
we do that, um, flesh and blood people are going to are may be seen as expendable.
Hmm.
During the from 1917, which saw the Bolshevik Revolution, up until let's say 1976, because that was the death of Mao Zedong in China. In between 1917 and 1976, It has been estimated by these two French authors that they wrote this book called the Black Book of Communism. They estimate that between 85 to 100 million people paid with their lives in the
Wow.
interest of building this so-called classless society between 1917 and 1976.
Hmm.
After Mao died, things got a lot better. The things started to open up in China, also in
Yeah.
the Soviet Union as well. After the death of Stalin, you had people being committed to psychiatric um,
Hmm.
um, asylums, rather than outright being murdered,
Yeah.
as was the case under Stalin. But if you try to start over, if you try to do things too rapidly, and people get in the way, ordinary people, um,
Get run over by the semi truck.
yeah, exactly, yeah. It's
Yeah.
it's it's a recipe for massive
Yeah.
injustice on a huge scale.
And that's where I feel like many of us, or many of the leaders in our country, are kind of taking the Machiavellian approach, which is, the ends justify the
Yeah,
means. If we saved a few
yeah,
dollars, it was worth destroying the lives of these people, you know?
yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah. So towards the end of the book, you state the following: God wants the world to be governed by laws and policies, so that human lawlessness may be restrained and that everything may be conducted in good order among human beings. Talk to us about that as we close out here.
God is a God of order.
Hmm.
As we live our lives, we take for granted that there is an orderly creation of which we are part. We take it for granted that when we eat breakfast in the morning, it's going to nourish us. That when
Hmm.
we get out of bed, we're not going to fly up to the ceiling. That the
Yeah.
gravity is going to hold us to the floor. When we get out of bed, we look outside and we recognize, there's the changing of the seasons. I don't generally dress this way in the summer, but in the winter, I wear a jacket, a turtleneck because they're warmer. These are the sorts of things that we take for granted. We take
Hmm.
for granted that that uh, that you and I are able to converse
Hmm.
in a
Yeah.
across you know several hundred miles, from Atlanta to Hamilton, and those are the sorts of things that we because God is an orderly God. He has placed us in an orderly creation, and we are embedded in multiple um, uh, manifestations of lawfulness.
Yeah.
And those laws, there are political laws, but they're the ordinary social norms
Hmm.
that enable us to be able to talk with each other, to be able to converse with each other, to be
Yeah.
able to etiquette, various rules that enable us to live with each other. And those are the sorts of things that I think were eroded very largely in the 1960s when I was growing up, and we haven't yet put everything back together again in a different way. And, we want to live in a lawful universe, in a
Yeah.
lawful society, because
Yeah.
that's the only way that we can flourish.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a funny meme that kind of goes around as touch grass, which is like implying like you've kind of been so disconnected because you're living in a dream world or you're so online. Like go outside and touch reality, right? And I
Okay,
think
yeah,
the idea there, I think it's similar. Like we take our societal construct for granted, but we also take reality for granted.
yeah.
And the good thing about God's universe is that it doesn't let us get too far away from reality without being feeling the pain of doing so.
That's exactly right. Yeah, yeah. And there's a difference between the sorts of, we live above, on top of the Niagara Escarpment. The Niagara Escarpment runs from Niagara Falls all the way up to Tobermory in the Bruce Peninsula of Ontario, but it actually goes under the lakes in a ways, and it actually ends up in Door County, Wisconsin. Where
Oh
where
wow.
where the Green Bay Packers play.
Yeah.
So that's and even south of that, not quite as far as the Illinois state line, but
Yeah.
but you cannot. Um, I can't walk off the edge. If I try to walk off the edge of the escarpment, I will fall.
Yeah.
Because it's a big cliff, and it's not,
Yeah.
it's within walking distance of our front door. And if I violate that law, the law of gravity, I feel it immediately.
Yeah.
If I violate social norms, I may not feel it immediately,
Mm.
but there will be consequences, and those
Hmm.
consequences will make themselves felt at some point.
Yeah.
People may not want to have much to do with me. I may have trouble forming stable friendships because I don't treat people very well.
Hmm.
And it's not, it may not be as immediate as falling off the edge of the Niagara Escarpment, but it's
Yeah.
a but there will be consequences at least down the line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I thank God for that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. Yeah.
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 So your book, Citizenship Without
Yeah.
Illusions: A Christian Guide to Political Engagement. Who should read this book? Who do you think is most interested in going and grabbing it from Amazon or Barnes and Noble?
Oh wow! I mean, I think virtually everybody should read it. It's
Yeah.
if it's aimed at Christians, but I think even non-Christians could benefit from it.
Yeah.
People who are especially people who have read my two earlier books. Especially the
Yeah.
first one, Political Visions and Illusions.
Yeah.
If you want to know how do you discharge the responsibilities of citizenship in a God-fearing way,
Yeah.
then read the book. It's not going to solve all the problems, but I think it does lay out the parameters
Hmm.
of the sorts of issues that we need to be concerned about as we're
Yeah.
thinking about how to be citizens.
Yeah. And I think if you're feeling the chaos and confusion and you want clarity and
Yeah,
stability, then this is a great book to give you that so that you can navigate the times ahead. And I think you also help remind us like just to take how much we take for granted even in this chaotic time and no matter how dark it gets.
yeah,
I mean, the Christians in the Roman Empire, I mean, it was pretty bad. So
yeah, yeah,
we're not that bad.
yeah,
And so, but they still inspirationally leaned in and they did things and they loved and they were the hands and feet of Christ in ways that I think we might not even know how to get to that level, because it's
yeah.
not nearly as bad. Yeah.
That's right. Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Any final thoughts? How can people connect with you? Where would you send them? You're on YouTube. You've got a blog.
Yeah,
You're on
yeah.
LinkedIn.
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel. If you put in my last name, Koyzis, ZIS, if you're American, you'll find it pretty easily. I have a blog called Notes from a Byzantine Rite Calvinist, in which
Yeah.
I post fairly regularly. I've been posting quite a lot recently because I've had quite a number of interviews, and I was in New York. I should have been in Pittsburgh last weekend, but illness prevented me going there. Um, but I'm fairly easy to find. There aren't very many Koyzises. It's not exactly a made up name, but
Yeah.
it was a name that my father adopted as recently as 1943.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's yeah. So if you find Koyzis, it'll be someone in our family, and it's likely to be me just because of
Yeah.
the books that I've written.
So
So
what's
yeah,
next for you?
that yeah. I have a manuscript that I'm trying to sell to a publisher. I see it as being the first volume in a kind of tetralogy.
Okay.
So, 4 volumes. I've written 3 books now. I see this one is going to be the faith basics. And so I'm laying out the contours of the Christian faith by going through the Heidelberg Catechism, this catechism, the Reformation Catechism that was published in 1563, and I'm that's what I'm working on. I also have um, an idea to write a book about liberal arts education at the university level.
Oh, okay.
That's not that I'm just thinking about that. I don't know whether that's going to come
Yeah.
to
What's
fruition
the
or not.
problem you want to solve?
Um, to have students be seeking education not simply because it will get them a job, but because it will shape them into full persons,
Hmm.
responsible persons, as those created in God's image.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Cool. Anything else you want to throw out there before we close out?
and I think that's it. Thank you, Jason. I love talking to you. You're a lot of fun to talk to.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. I appreciate you sharing your
Yeah,
wisdom and insight and experience and stories. So thank you.
You're very welcome.